Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
After my divorce 3 years ago, I found myself struggling to maintain my career in Seattle while raising 3 kids on my own. The cost of living there had become astronomical, and despite working overtime at my marketing job, I could barely keep up with the bills. When my landlord announced a 30% rent increase, I knew it was time to make a tough decision. Moving back to my hometown in Missouri wasn't exactly my dream scenario, but it made financial sense. My parents were there, my siblings were there, and most importantly, the cost of living was something I could actually manage. I found a decent 2-bedroom apartment and a job at the local warehouse working the late shift. Transportation was our biggest hurdle. Taking the bus with 3 kids was challenging, especially when I had to work late. Sometimes I'd have to call my parents or friends for rides, which made me feel like a burden. That's when my sister approached me with what seemed like a generous offer. My sister noticed I was struggling with transportation and offered to sell me her old van that was sitting in her driveway for $500. I was shocked at the offer and told her excitedly that I could get the money together by next week. She told me to just get it registered and insured, and it would be mine. I thought this was a turning point for us. Growing up, we'd always had a complicated relationship. She was the type who needed to be in control, always trying to one-up everyone. But this seemed different, like she was finally trying to help without strings attached. For about 3 months, everything was perfect. I could drive to work without depending on anyone, take the kids to school, and even go grocery shopping without planning it like a military operation. Then came the day the front axle broke. The horrible grinding noise and the mechanic's estimate of $3,000–4,000 for repairs felt like a punch to the gut. The apartment complex manager wasn't sympathetic either. He told me that I had 30 days to remove the vehicle from the property, citing their policy against non-functioning vehicles in the parking lot. I called my friend who runs a scrapyard business. I asked if there was any way he could take the van off my hands since I couldn't afford to fix it. He agreed to give me a few hundred for scrap and said he'd come pick it up the following week. The day they came to haul it away, I was at work. My phone rang with a call from the sheriff's department. The deputy told me that my sister was there filing a stolen vehicle report, claiming I had stolen and scrapped her van without permission. I was shocked and told him I had bought the van from her and had all the paperwork. He instructed me to come down to the station with any documentation I had. I rushed to my apartment, grabbed the title and bill of sale, and headed to the police station. My sister was there, putting on quite a show. She was yelling that it was her van and that she had never sold it to me, accusing me of stealing it and scrapping it for quick cash. I calmly presented the title and bill of sale, both signed by her, and mentioned that my friend who scrapped it was on his way with the documentation. The sheriff reviewed all the paperwork, including the scrapyard's documentation and VIN photos. His expression changed from suspicious to annoyed, but not at me. He sternly warned my sister that filing a false police report was a serious offense, explaining that the documentation clearly showed this was a legal sale and I had every right to scrap the vehicle. He told her he could arrest her right then for wasting police resources and making false accusations. My sister tried to argue that the van was worth way more than $500 and claimed I had taken advantage of her. The sheriff shut her down, telling her that the agreed-upon sale price wasn't a police matter, but filing false reports was. He gave her a final warning that if she tried something like this again, she would be arrested. My sister stormed out of the station, but not before screaming that I was dead to her and telling me to never contact her or her family again. I simply replied that that worked perfectly for me. That was 6 years ago, and I haven't spoken to her since. My life has actually improved significantly. I got promoted at work, saved up for a reliable used car, and my kids are thriving. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, and in this case, cutting ties with my sister was the best thing that could have happened. The funny thing is, she still tells everyone who'll listen that I stole her van, but nobody believes her anymore. Her reputation for drama finally caught up with her. Being a blind person means dealing with all sorts of misconceptions and ignorant behavior daily. I've learned to handle most situations with patience, but sometimes people push way beyond reasonable boundaries. Yesterday was one of those days that really tested my limits. Since my parents are in the high-risk category for COVID, I've taken over most of the grocery shopping duties. As a blind person, shopping requires some extra steps. I usually need staff assistance, and I always have my guide dog Shadow with me. Most people are respectful, but Shadow's presence tends to attract unwanted attention. I was almost done with my shopping when I heard the familiar excited squeal of a child. She was asking if she could pet my dog. I turned toward the voice and explained gently that Shadow was a working guide dog and couldn't be petted. To my surprise, the little girl was completely understanding. She actually seemed fascinated by the idea of a dog having a job and asked several thoughtful questions before going on her way. After finishing my shopping, I decided to grab lunch at the food court. I had just settled down with my food when I overheard the same little girl talking to someone nearby, explaining to her mother about meeting me and learning about guide dogs. The mother's response immediately set off warning bells in my head. The mother stormed over to my table and demanded to know why I was lying to her daughter about being blind. I kept my voice calm and explained that I wasn't lying, that I was indeed blind, and had simply explained to her daughter why she couldn't pet my guide dog. She snapped back that I couldn't be blind, claiming that since her sister was blind, she knew what blind people looked like. She accused me of making excuses to prevent her daughter from petting my dog. I tried explaining that not all blind people are the same, and that knowing one blind person doesn't mean she knows how every blind person appears or functions. She then pointed out that I was using a phone and that my eyes looked normal, insisting that I stop lying. I explained that blind people can use phones and that blindness presents differently in different people, emphasizing that her sister's condition isn't universal. The mother's voice rose as she declared that her daughter had been well-behaved all day and therefore deserved to pet my dog. I refused, explaining that Shadow was working and it wasn't safe to pet working guide dogs. She then shrieked that she was getting security and threatened that I'd better be gone when she returned. I continued eating my lunch, thinking she was just making empty threats. About 5 minutes later, I heard her stomping back with a security guard in tow. She announced to the guard that I was pretending to be blind to keep my dog in the building. The security guard asked if Shadow was a service dog, and I confirmed that he was my guide dog, offering to show documentation if needed. The guard hesitantly asked if I could prove I was blind. I questioned how I could possibly prove that and why I should have to. The mother interrupted, pointing out that my eyes weren't cloudy like she thought blind people's eyes should be. Growing frustrated, I explained that not all blind people have cloudy eyes and requested that he ask her to leave me alone. The guard uncomfortably suggested that since she had a blind sister, maybe she knew something about it. Before I could respond, I felt someone grab Shadow's harness handle. The mother had seized it, yanking him toward her daughter, while shouting that now I had to let her daughter pet him. I panicked. Taking my guide dog's harness is like stealing someone's eyes. I started screaming for help. A second security guard rushed over and asked what was happening. I explained that she was taking my guide dog and pleaded for help. The second guard ordered her to let go of the dog immediately. She refused, claiming I was faking and that the first guard had given her permission. The first guard quickly denied this claim. The second guard pried her hands off Shadow's harness. I immediately commanded him to lead me to the exit, my heart pounding. Behind me, I could hear the mother screaming and the guard radioing for backup. I called the police from outside and waited. When they arrived, they reviewed the security footage. The mother didn't just get arrested for harassing me and interfering with my service dog. She earned herself an extra charge by taking a swing at one of the officers who tried to escort her out. Later that evening, I learned she'd also been banned from the shopping center permanently. The store manager called to apologize and offered me a gift card, but more importantly, they promised to implement better training for their security staff about service dogs and disabilities. I've always loved spending time at my parents' house, especially during spring break from high school. We have this beautiful property with an open field where we keep some beehives. It's peaceful, except when entitled neighbors try to cause trouble. This whole mess started on a rainy Wednesday. My brother was visiting our parents, and being the helpful person he is, decided to get the mail before parking. He drives this small red Ford truck our parents gave him for work. Nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. The only problem is our mailbox sits at the opposite end of this huge field from our house, and when it rains, that field turns into a mud pit. I was hanging out on the porch when I saw my brother's truck get stuck in the mud. My dad came out to assess the situation, debating whether we needed a tow truck. My brother, always the problem solver, suggested we could shovel some gravel from the driveway to give the tires traction. While they went to get the wheelbarrow, I stayed by the truck enjoying my music. That's when this guy in a white Chevy SUV showed up at the far end of the field. He stormed over to me, his face red as a tomato, sporting this thick southern accent that made him sound like a cartoon character. He immediately started yelling at me, accusing me of being the jerk who ran over his mailbox and ruined his lawn. I responded with annoyance, telling him that I was only 17 and didn't even own the truck, suggesting he should talk to my brother, who was the actual owner. I could see my dad and brother walking back with a wheelbarrow when this guy started marching towards them. He immediately began shouting about how our truck had destroyed his property and demanding we pay for all the damages. My dad asked him what he was talking about, clearly confused. The man got even more worked up, telling us not to play dumb and explaining that someone in a red truck had torn up his yard, smashed his fountain, and ran over his mailbox. He was convinced it had to be us. My brother tried to calmly explain that we'd been nowhere near his property, but the man wouldn't listen. He threatened to call the police and have us arrested, claiming he knew we did it. My dad calmly told him to go ahead since we hadn't done anything wrong. The man's final threat was about getting his lawyer involved before he stormed off in his SUV, throwing dirt everywhere as he accelerated. My brother and I exchanged looks, trying not to laugh. See, what this hothead didn't know was that my brother's truck has this really discreet dash cam installed. You'd have to be right up against the windshield to even notice it. A month passed, and we didn't hear a peep about any lawsuit. Today I was helping my dad with some yard work when I spotted that same guy with his 2 kids trying to fix up their yard. It was a mess, dirt scattered everywhere, tire tracks cutting across the lawn like some drunk rally driver had a field day, and pieces of what used to be a fancy fountain scattered around. My brother pulled up the dash cam footage again that evening just to double check. The timestamps proved what we already knew. His truck was nowhere near that guy's property when the damage happened. Last week my dad was at the local hardware store and overheard someone talking about a drunk teenager in a red pickup who'd been joyriding through people's yards on the night that guy's property was damaged. Apparently the kid's parents made him confess to the police, and he's been going around making arrangements to pay for all the damage he caused. I saw our neighbor again yesterday. He was power washing his driveway, and when he spotted me, he quickly looked away and hurried inside. I guess it's harder to make false accusations when the real culprit has been caught. My brother wanted to go over and show him the dashcam footage just to rub it in, but my dad suggested that letting him stew in his embarrassment was punishment enough. After my spouse passed away last year, I couldn't bear staying in our old house anymore. Every corner held memories that were just too painful to face daily. I decided to use the life insurance money to buy a smaller place in a quiet suburban neighborhood about an hour away from the city. The house wasn't huge, but it had this gorgeous backyard with mature trees and a well-maintained garden. Exactly what I needed for my healing journey. The first week was peaceful. I spent most of my time setting up my home office. I work as a remote software developer and tending to the garden. Everything seemed perfect until I noticed a large golden retriever running around my yard one morning while I was having my coffee on the back porch. At first I thought it was a stray, but then I heard someone calling from next door. The neighbor called out to me, telling me not to mind Duke, saying he just loves my yard. I walked over to my fence to see a woman in her mid-40s wearing expensive workout clothes and holding a cup of coffee. I asked if this was her dog, and she enthusiastically confirmed it was, gushing about how much he adores my space. I politely told her that while I appreciated that, I'd prefer if the dog stayed in her yard. She immediately protested, explaining that their yard was too small and pointed out all the space I had. She insisted that Duke needed his exercise and that my yard was perfect for him. When I reminded her this was my private property, she had the nerve to call me selfish, pointing out that I was living there alone anyway and questioned what harm sharing would do. I was taken aback by her entitlement but tried to remain polite. I apologized but told her she needed to keep her dog in her own yard, explaining that I was planning to plant more flowers and didn't want them destroyed. She just scoffed and walked away without responding. The next day, I came home from grocery shopping to find a doghouse being constructed in my yard. The neighbor's husband was actually building it right next to my favorite apple tree. When I asked what he thought he was doing, he casually explained that his wife had mentioned Duke needed a shaded spot in my yard for his afternoon naps. I immediately told him I never agreed to this and demanded he remove it immediately. His wife shouted from over the fence, telling me not to be ridiculous because they had already bought all the materials, and tried to convince me by saying it matched my house's color scheme perfectly. I told them I didn't care if it was made of gold. This was my property and they were trespassing. The husband tried to reason with me, saying Duke was already attached to my yard. I was furious, but decided to handle this legally. I called the police department's non-emergency line and reported the trespassing. An officer came by and made them remove the doghouse, but my neighbors were livid. For the next week, they kept accidentally leaving their gate open so Duke could wander into my yard. I installed security cameras and documented every incident. I also filed complaints with the Homeowners Association and the city about their failure to control their pet. Last Saturday, I woke up to the sound of music and chatter. When I looked out my window, there were bouncy castles, tables with food, and about 30 people in my backyard. They had decorated my trees with balloons and streamers, and there was a large banner that read, "Happy 3rd Birthday, Duke." I immediately called the police while recording everything on my phone. When officers arrived, my neighbor had the audacity to act surprised. She tried to justify their actions by saying they just assumed it would be fine since I never used the yard anyway, and that Duke loves it there. The police officer told her this was trespassing and that they needed to remove everything immediately. She tried to protest, whining about how they had already paid the caterer and all their guests were there. I simply told her that wasn't my problem. The police made everyone leave, and I pressed charges for trespassing. But I didn't stop there. During all of this chaos, I had been in contact with my lawyer, documenting every incident. We filed a lawsuit for continuous harassment and trespassing. The court ordered them to pay for damages to my yard. Their dog had destroyed several flower beds, mandated the installation of proper fencing at their expense, and issued a restraining order that prevented both them and their dog from entering my property. The Homeowners Association fined them heavily for multiple violations, and they ended up selling their house 3 months later. I now have peaceful neighbors who respect boundaries, and my garden has never looked better. I even adopted a cat who loves watching the birds from my porch in my dog-free yard. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.